Thank you so much. That means a lot. 2 weeks ago today, on June the 12th, that was the most difficult day in the history of the city of Orlando. But today I could not be more proud of our community and how it responded. We've not been defined by a hate-filled act of a radical killer, but rather by our collective response of love, compassion, and unity. We are Orlando United. On behalf of everybody in Orlando, all of our residents, all of our families, I want to start out by saying thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of my fellow mayors. Thank you to the residents of each of your cities. Everyone knows that Orlando is a place where America goes to have fun. But when we needed it most, your cities came to Orlando's aid. You had our back, and unequivocally, these have been the worst 2 weeks in Orlando's history, and I can't tell you how much it meant to us to feel your love and your support after this unimaginable tragedy. And I can't tell you how much it meant to see your landmarks, bridges and buildings lit up in the colors of the rainbow to let us know that we weren't alone in Orlando. And on a personal level, I cannot thank you enough for the resources that you sent, the vigils that you led, the phone calls and text messages and emails that many of you, just about all of you that are in this room actually, made to offer either advice or help or just to say that your thoughts and your prayers were with us. So on behalf of everyone, and I will return some of those calls at some point, on behalf of everyone that calls Orlando home, please allow me to thank you. So I struggled with whether or not to leave Orlando and come to the conference. It's been less than 2 weeks. Well, it's been exactly 2 weeks since an act of violence terrorized and crippled our city. And I know that we're eventually going to get through this, but every day brings unexpected challenges. And every day I talk to victims and families or residents who remain in a state of shock. So it's still so hard for us to comprehend how and why this could possibly happen in Orlando. But I'm here with you after what happened in Orlando because it's clear to me that we live in a new world, a world that any one of our cities could be the site of this kind of intentional mass casualty event, a world where each one of our cities needs to be better prepared to respond to this type of incident. And I'm not talking about a hurricane or a tornado. I'm talking about an intentional act of violence that takes the lives of our residents and wreaks havoc on our cities. So that's the reason that I feel it's important to talk to you today. It's important that we as mayors begin a larger discourse about how we prepare for and respond to these types of events. I want to stay away from politics and the heated topics that are discussed on the national news. There are a lot of politics involved in this country that might go to finding ways to prevent these sorts of attacks: guns, terrorism, equality, fairness, and they're big, big, difficult issues. And overcoming those challenges are going to take a willingness to forge partnerships and the ability to stop vilifying other Americans who don't agree with you, something that our country doesn't seem to be able to do very well lately. And I'm going to let others take the lead on that conversation. But what I want to focus on is mayors and our responsibilities. I want to talk about we as mayors, what we can do to be ready and what we can do to foster the kinds of communities that help prevent incidents and that are prepared to respond to them. The way that Orlando responded to this tragedy probably hasn't been perfect, but I'm extraordinarily proud of the way that we did respond. And I'm proud of the way that our residents and our city staff stepped up under extraordinary circumstances. I have never been more proud of our police officers, our firefighters, all of our first responders, the doctors that treated the victims that night, and then our city employees. I believe there are lessons to be learned from Orlando, just as we sought counsel from responders in Boston and San Bernardino, in Charleston. I talked to Mayor Riley on his way out today, in Aurora and other places that have been under this type of attack. Our long-term vision is to work with you, my fellow mayors, and their staffs to put together a comprehensive formal examination of best practices. And that examination will be shared with the U.S. Conference of Mayors for all of our cities. And there's obviously no such thing as an all-purpose emergency manual, but by sharing what we have learned, we can help all of our cities be better prepared. So that's our long-term goal. For today, I want to offer just a few basic insights into how our city team managed the incident, with hope that it serves as a first step towards larger preparation. So what I want to do right now is take you back to the night of June the 12th. So I'm asleep. It's about 3 a.m. in the morning, and I get a phone call. I get the phone call that every one of you dread getting, and it's Deputy Chief Bobby Nzoido, and he says, "Mayor, I need to inform you that there's an active shooter in the Pulse nightclub. There are multiple casualties, and there are now hostages." So I did what any other parent would do. I called my 26-year-old son to see where he was, and fortunately he had his phone charged up and was able to answer and tell me that he was asleep in bed, which gave me peace of mind to go do what I needed to do. My police liaison officer was already on the way, picked me up, and then we picked up my deputy chief of staff, who is in charge of communications in our city. And we arrived at the mobile command center, which was already occupied by the chief of police and his deputies, the sheriffs of 3 counties, the FDLE, Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the FBI. So when I walked in, I was sitting next to the chief, and I thought, what are my goals here? My first goal is don't get in the way. The second was do not undermine the chief's command. And the third was to gather as much information as I possibly could for communication later on. So they brought me up to speed on what had occurred between 2:02 and the time that I got there, which was 3:45-ish. So there had been gunfire heard in the Pulse nightclub. We had an off-duty officer that was working there, but he was occupied in the parking lot with another incident when the gunfire started. So he ran to the front door of the club and engaged in a gunfight with the shooter. The shooter went back into the club, and in about 3 minutes, we had 4 SWAT officers and several other officers from different agencies respond and knock through a window for entry, and the shooter retreated into a back bathroom where there were hostages located, and there was a second bathroom across the hallway from him. So we secured the site in terms of having the shooter secured in one bathroom, but there were hostages there. But that gave us the opportunity for additional officers and firefighters to help the victims that were still living, the wounded, out. And fortunately, we had a level 1 trauma center that's about a quarter of the mile down the road, and we actually transported about half the victims there in the back of a police officer's pickup truck and made do and saved a lot of lives through that. We were rescuing victims, and from some of the responding officers, we were under the impression that there were between 25 and 30 dead. So they had all been rescued at that point. When we received a 911 call from the shooter who declared his allegiance to the State of Islam, and he also made a couple of additional calls to our crisis negotiators, or actually it was the other way around. So for the next hour or so, we were in communication with the shooter, and we didn't know it at the time, but he was also in communication with another TV station, on social media, so he was pretty active in his communications. And we also had the hostages that were in both bathrooms who were either directly in communication with 911 or were texting to somebody else on the outside and giving us information. So we were getting real-time information from the people that were located in the bathrooms. At one point, the shooter says that he's going to put on an explosive vest, and he's talked about bombs throughout the course of this, and put vest on 4 of the hostages that are in the bathroom, and then send them to the 4 corners of the nightclub. It also indicated that there were explosives in his car, which were parked in the parking lot. The chief made the decision at that point to breach the building, and SWAT had responded and had a perimeter secured, and they put an explosive device on the wall that was to the bathroom that did not have the shooter in it. It did not totally breach the wall, so we had a Bearcat. I don't know if any of you guys have that, but it's basically an armored battering ram. And they were able to punch 4 holes into the wall. 15 hostages came streaming out with a shooter quickly behind him. He engaged our SWAT officers, actually shot one in the Kevlar helmet, that if that shot had been 2 inches lower, that officer would have lost his life, but the equipment that he had saved his life, and they took the shooter down. At that point, the FBI determined that that was an act of terrorism, and they took charge of the investigation to follow. I'm not going to go into detail, but there was still the issue of whether the club was booby-trapped, so it took a while to secure the crime scene based on trying to make sure that we didn't end up with an explosion. They began clearing, and we turned our attention to communication strategy. And I knew going in that communicating with the public was going to be my most important job. We had a couple of hurricanes come through, 3 actually, in 2004, and that was the lesson learned there, that communication with the public during a crisis is the mayor's most important job. So our first 2 press conferences were the most important that we had, and there was no question that as the mayor, I needed to lead out at the press conferences, because everybody else that was going to be speaking were FBI, FDLE, unknown in our community. And it was important, in our estimation, that amid this tragedy, the community immediately hear from someone that they knew, first out, and someone that they trusted. And there were 3 things that we wanted to communicate, or 3 ways we wanted to communicate. We wanted to communicate very concise recitation of facts. We wanted to communicate that we had this under control, and we wanted to communicate that the residents of Orlando were safe, that there wasn't another incident that was going to occur, that the gunman had acted alone in this instance. And in the very first press conference, we were able to set the tone for the day. We were able to bring some calm to the disorder. I'm going to tell you just 2 little things. At that very first press conference at the end, the police chief was asked a question by a reporter, and the reporter said, we understand there are 20 dead. And the chief said, yes, there are 20 dead. Well, we knew that there were more than 20 dead at that point. So I turned around, we walked, and I said, Chief, the next time we talk, I have to tell them how many dead there are. And one of my deputy chief, our deputy communications director, deputy chief of staff, walked up, and she had just been informed that the total was in fact 50, not 20. So when we went out to the second press conference, that was the hardest moment I had during the whole process. And I had to take a very deep breath and a big gulp and say, it's 50, not 20. And you could hear a collective gasp from the reporters at that point. So we set the tone, and then there was just a continuum of different things that happened. But the other most important thing that we did, we cleared the scene at 4 o'clock, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I had a nice conversation with a medical examiner, and it stressed how important it was for us to get the victims identified and then make notification. And that guy rocked. He was a superstar. By 7 o'clock the next morning, when I returned to the scene, and he got the last of the victims at 11 o'clock, he had identified 48 of the 49 victims, and by mid-afternoon, we had been able to notify the families of all of those victims as well. And I can tell you it would have been a much different scenario if we had been spending 2 or 3 days trying to identify people. So that's just kind of a narrative that I want you to have in mind as I give you what I think are a couple of lessons learned. So I recall on Sunday morning how fortunate we were to be able to call on our partners in the community of every conceivable sort. The relationships that we had with these partners were product of a lot of hard work that is hard work for a mayor to do. Our Islamic community and other faith-based leaders, the business leaders who immediately got funding in place to help the victims, our law enforcement agencies, and the ones that I mentioned, I've never seen a more seamless operation. They knew each other, they worked directly together, and there was no ego involved on anyone. They all did their job. And I didn't have to go through any intermediaries because, well, one benefit, I've been mayor 14 years now, so the contacts are pretty much in my phone. And as mayors, I think it shows the value in doing the daily work of being a mayor and touching your people, touching everybody. Sometimes it's tiresome to participate in all these community events, and I know sometimes it is overwhelming, but I can tell you, every Ramadan dinner that I've taken part in, every law enforcement convention, every neighborhood meeting, every volunteer dinner, every gay pride parade, and yes, every U.S. Conference of Mayors meeting I've attended over the years has helped me and helped our city forge relationships that we were immediately able to tap into in our response. And you can't create those relationships on the fly. You have to build those over time. Second is investing in preparation. So another realization we've had is the importance of investing in the tools, the technology, the training of our police and fire departments, and training jointly together with all of the surrounding agencies, and particularly in this post-recession world. There have been times where our local governments were perhaps overly scrutinized or criticized for some of the investments we've made in police and fire and some of the militarized types of weapons and vehicles that we have, but because of these investments, we have done mass casualty exercises with our first responders. They were ready to go, and we ensured that they were equipped with virtually everything to respond. I got to tell you, I caught a bunch of flack when we bought the Bearcat. You can imagine that, right? So if we had not had that Bearcat that night, we would not have gotten in that building when we did, and I'm quite certain there would have been additional victims. Financial readiness is also important. A lot of us took drastic cuts the last several years, and having a tragedy like this shows why contingency funds, having them available, are important. And finally, I'm going to tell you one that you would never have thought of. We were fortunate that in the city we established a 501c3 to handle an art program that we have and a Paramore Kids Zone program in a neighborhood, so that we could receive funds through a not-for-profit. And it turns out that the day after, so on Monday, Disney wanted to give us $1 million check, and we actually had somewhere that we could take that check and didn't have to rely on an outside organization that may or may not have been the means or the type of means that we wanted to do. We have, by the way, almost $10 million in that fund in less than how many ever days it is, 12 days since we set that up. The community and national response to that has just been incredible. And that's another area, New York, Boston, we borrowed from you guys. We got the gentleman that did those funds. I think he's actually done 7 of the funds. And that's another lesson. There's other people that have done some part of this. Find them and use them. Don't try to make it up on the run. So finally, the last thing I want to talk about in the last 2 weeks is the value of having really, really great people in your organization. I can't stress how important that is, because there are so many people from the city of Orlando that are driving so far out of their lane, I'm not sure they can see the center line. And when you're making hires anywhere within our city family, there's a lot of value on hiring those who have a desire to serve and go above and beyond with customer service. And as the mayor, you set that tone. I'm a delegator. Some mayors are in the weeds and some are delegators. I'm a delegator. So you have to have good people, and then you got to turn them loose and let them perform. And I always tell my staff, I think we've got a culture here that 95% of the time, anybody that's a decision maker would make the same decision that I would make. But the other 5% of the time, I got your back, and I'm not going to second guess that decision. So hundreds of those employees stepped in the roles they didn't anticipate. They did it with professionalism and grace, and others just put their heads down and did their job and covered for them. And as our CAO says, they did better than they had ever done before. So I want to just close with, it's strange to turn on a TV in a place like Indianapolis and still have Orlando as one of the lead news stories. And it almost doesn't feel real, but we know at some point the cameras are going to leave. And when that happens, our pain will remain and the work of picking up the pieces will remain. And that work, I want you to know, was made easier because of the love and the support that Orlando and its residents have received from so many cities around this country. Thank you for that love and support.